Like I mentioned in the previous video, version control is essential to our work at Treehouse. Without Git or some other VCS, my job would be significantly more painful day to day. But why? Using a VCS is extra work, and the advantages aren't always obvious. In fact, some people don't see any benefit to using a VCS at all and choose to work without one. Why don't we take a look at one of their projects? We haven't really talked about what a VCS is exactly just yet, but maybe by looking at some of the problems you can run into without one, we can get some clues about how they'd be helpful. I've asked Andrew to join us and play the part of someone who's decided not to use a VCS in their project. We call these people cowboy coders, but not because they're actually cowboys. We call them cowboy coders because they choose to work without regard for accepted best practices, much like the cowboys of legend had little need for law in the Old West. Thanks for doing this, Andrew.
No worries. Where do we start?
Well, let's assume that you're a web developer, and you've been hired by a client to build this really neat web application.
I'd probably start with one file, an HTML prototype to help me figure out what the client wants.
Great. So you're doing work on the prototype, probably for several days. You open the file, make changes, and save them to disk.
Of course.
Maybe at some point you add a really cool feature to the prototype and send it off to the client for review, but the client doesn't really like it and asks you to remove it.
Oh, I hate it when that happens.
Yeah, me too, but she is the client. So you delete the feature and keep working. But then a couple of days later, she changes her mind. She really does want that feature after all.
Hooray!
But you already deleted it from the code.
Oh. Well, I guess I would have to write it up again.
Yeah, but that's not ideal, is it? You've already written it, and maybe it was a lot of work. It's a pity to have to redo it all. What if you had a copy of the old version?
Yeah, maybe I could dig through my emails and find a copy.
Well, let me make a suggestion. What if every time you made a change to your prototype, you saved a new copy of the file?
Oh, like prototype 1, prototype 2, prototype 3, something like that?
Yeah, exactly. Now you have a record of every change you made, so if you need to go back and look at any of your older code, it's all right there.
But how do I know which number corresponds to which feature?
You could add a description of your changes to the file name, maybe. So, prototype 1 getting started instead of prototype 1. Then you can just look for whichever version has the description, added awesome feature.
I've got a lot more files to work with now, which isn't ideal, but at least this way I won't lose any of my work.
Yeah. But here, what happens after you start writing the real site? You're not going to be working with just one file anymore, are you?
No, I'll probably have lots of HTML files at some point, some CSS files, JavaScript files, and maybe even a README. Am I going to need to keep multiple copies of each of these files? That would get really messy.
Yeah, it is going to be messy, especially since some of the files are related now.
What do you mean?
Well, think about our example from earlier when you added a new feature to the site. When you just had the one file prototype, adding that new feature meant you only had to update the one file. Now, though, you might need to update both an HTML file and a JavaScript file, maybe a CSS file too. If it's a really big feature, you might need to touch a lot of files. How are you going to keep all that in sync?
What if instead of keeping multiple copies of files, I kept copies of the entire project?
So a lot of copies of the whole project folder? I suppose that could work. I hope you have a lot of disk space, though. On a big project, all of these copies are going to add up pretty fast.
Yeah, maybe I should uninstall a few games, make some room.
While you're doing that, the client just added a new wrinkle. She thinks you're doing a great job on the site so far, but she's just hired another developer to help you out.
Great, I could do with some help.
But how are you going to share your work with this new developer?
I guess I could copy it up to a server somewhere. I'd have to teach this new person about our brilliant copying strategy to make sure he follows the rules.
That works. So you give the new developer a task, and you start on your new task, and you guys are both working along at the same time.
I think I know where you're going with this.
Yeah. What happens when you both finish? You've probably both worked on some of the same files, so how do you merge those changes together into one version you can show the client?
That sounds like a pain. I guess we'd have to compare them side by side and then decide what to keep or what to change.
What you could do, what if you worked with 2 other people, though, instead of just the one, or 5, or 20?
Between all the copying and pasting and comparing files, I don't know that I'd ever get any actual code done. Wow, that's a lot of hard work. But what's this got to do with version control systems?
Well, if you think about it, all that extra work you were doing, you were pretty much just managing all the different versions of your project as you worked on it.
So renaming the folders and naming them in those different types of ways is what version control systems do under the hood. We were just doing that manually.
Absolutely.
Cool.
Thanks for the help.
No worries.
Hopefully that conversation has already given you some ideas about what a VCS does and how they can save you a lot of time and effort. In the next video, we'll discuss these advantages in more detail, but first let's see how well you picked up on some of the ideas in our little story.